A world exists beyond that mundane little life that you live in. A world where intelligence is worshipped and pilots are God. A world filled with biotechnology that can save lives or end them.
A war is brewing beneath the surface of everything you understand to be real. Ours is a tale of revenge, love, and desperate ambition. Will you come with us?
I see you standing there, straight in an arrogance what I wouldn't give to tear you down.
Welcome to episode 4 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. We are your hosts, Ellie Popov
and Charles Jazz Terrier. Low listener, what are we waiting for?
Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry. Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry.
Wyatt sat across the table from Crystal, watching as she frowned at the yellow laminated menu clutched in her perfectly polished fingers. Bedroom eyes, she'd said the color was when he'd stumbled at complimenting her earlier. The waiter of the small Thai restaurant stood nearby, tapping his notepad impatiently waiting for Crystal to make up her mind. As Wyatt waited too, he battled with where to place his hands on the gold and purple embossed tablecloth. Giving up, he instead sipped at his glass of water. His hands became embarrassingly moist with condensation, so he wiped them quickly onto his jeans, frowning at the wet stain they left. He decided to leave them in his lap. The waiter cleared her throat, prompting Crystal along. Crystal looked up from her menu. Is the salmon organic? The waiter looked like his almond eyes were going to pop out of his head. Organic? He repeated in disbelief. It comes from the ocean, miss. Crystal was thrilled at the response, completely naive of the man's growing frustration. Great. Well, that's so much better than the pellet farms, right? I mean, sustainable, yes. Tasty, no. Crystal finished with a little giggle at her own remark. Wyatt felt a flush creep into his cheeks, embarrassed on Crystal's behalf. Despite her ignorance, Wyatt can't help but notice how beautiful she looked tonight. Crystal had squeezed her caramel curves into a tight, blush pink dress and dipped her perfectly pedicured feet into a pair of nude stilettos. Her makeup was flawless, a genuine asset to her elegant features. And she'd done it all for him. He could forgive her ignorance. Wyatt watched the quivering flame of the table's centerpiece reflect in Crystal's eyes as she looked down at the menu momentarily before flicking her thick eyelashes back up. He looked at his own menu to avoid the waiter's gaze. The waiter tried again to nudge Crystal along. Caught from the ocean, marinated in garlic, ginger, a little sugar. Crystal's frown returned with a vengeance. Oh, that's a shame. Sugar is a carb. I can't eat carbs. Genuinely shocked, the waiter asked, Are you allergic? To cellulite, yeah. Look, do you have anything without carbs, organically sourced? Wyatt caught a glimpse of the waiter's face, who was now not only frustrated but baffled. Let me check with the chef. The waiter moved swiftly, clearly wanting to put a quick distance between the golden-skinned goddess before Wyatt and himself. Crystal turned to Wyatt, her own frustrations wiped from her expression, and offered him her sweetest smile. So, this is fun, right? His heart thumped of its own volition at her words. Wyatt wiped clammy hands on his pants. Right. Brown eyes, warm as melted chocolate, seemed to scan him. Wyatt thought Crystal looked somewhat pleased with her findings. And look at you, I almost don't recognize you without a keyboard under your fingertips. Wyatt laughed awkwardly. I'm really glad we could get together. He paused, wondering if he should push his luck. Wondering if he really wanted to know. I was surprised you asked, actually. Don't be silly, Crystal pouted at him. You're loads of fun. I totally need your help. Wyatt's nerves gave way to confusion. My help? Crystal's smile broadened as Wyatt clued on, and her voice turned to smooth silk. Yes, I was hoping you'd offer. Thank you so much. My computer's gotten a virus and has deleted everything, like everything. I was hoping you'd take a look at it for me. She leaned in towards Wyatt, giving him a clear view down the top of her dress. In exchange for dinner, of course. My shout. Wyatt's heart plummeted into his mouth, and his body temperature seemed to rise, feverish in its embarrassment and anger. His illusions for the evening had come crashing down. Crystal eyed him, searching his expression. So, you need my tech assistance. That's why you asked me here. The words came out harsher and more desperate than Wyatt meant them to be. Crystal gasped innocently, realizing his hopes had rested elsewhere. Shit, Wyatt, I'm sorry. I'm giving you the wrong idea here. A flush rose in Crystal's face, and Wyatt rushed to quell it, trying to excuse them both from the embarrassment of the evening. Oh, no, don't be silly. Shaking her head, she placed a hand on the table before them, half reached towards Wyatt. Look, she began in the most serious voice he'd ever heard her use. I'm a handful, okay? Trust me. Wyatt barely nodded in response at her warning. His anxiety peaking almost out of control. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was a handful. But Wyatt had wanted her to be his handful. Just once, he wanted to be the kind of guy who got a woman like Crystal. The kind of guy capable of capturing a woman's attention at all. Wyatt scanned the environment around their table. The sea of customers became a blur of random faces he was sure was staring at him, judging him, privy to his rejection. He looked around the restaurant for an escape. At that moment, the waiter chose to return. A smile pasted fakely on his face. I have had a chat to the chef. And apologies, miss, but he says only the snake beans are organic. Wyatt expected Crystal to debate with the waiter and return to her difficult self. Instead, she smiled brightly. Great, I'll take those and a coffee. Do you have almond milk? Crystal's voice was drowned out by the pounding inside Wyatt's chest. Inside his mind, her answer told Wyatt that she was looking for an escape too. He could feel the perspiration gather in the roots of his hair on his forehead. The pounding escalated painfully. Wyatt closed his eyes in a futile attempt to calm himself. Wyatt opened his eyes to the rhythmic pulsing and cheering of the crowd spread amongst the placement arena boundaries. His eyes were only on Frey, from her place between Jasper and Isaiah. Frey's steely gaze was softened with victory, perhaps even their shared kiss. Gunnar and Manning swarmed the arena floor, tittering through their golden microphones to the patrons who continued to cheer so loud Wyatt thought his eardrums might burst. He ignored it all for Frey. Wyatt watched her tilt her head towards him, hungry for her approval that came through loud and clear. Frey had known that he could win, and she was right. It made him think briefly to the things he could have achieved if he'd had this kind of support all his life, if his mother had lived, or if Frey had found him earlier. Their eyes lingered on each other for a moment longer before Frey turned to Jasper, speaking something that made the warrior roll in his eyes. Then she turned to Isaiah, who moved from her side, snaking his way around the boundary, probably coming to fetch him. Closest to Wyatt in the arena, Fergus was deconstructing his gaming spheres. As Wyatt waited for his pit captain to finish, he ran a finger over his lip, where Frey had left her kiss on his mouth. From the door of the holding pit, Isaiah entered the arena and stalked across the circle to greet them. Fergus, still unscrewing the last bolts from the gaming pillars with a small drill, glanced up at the approaching Isaiah. He flicked her gaze to Wyatt. Go ahead, he uttered, mouthful of bolts. Wyatt, though elated and desperate to return to Frey, looked between Isaiah and Fergus, unsure if he should really leave the man to clean up behind him. I'll, see you inside? Fergus looked at him confused. Yes, you will. Smiling at Isaiah, Wyatt expected the giant to say something about his victory, but Isaiah remained a man of no words. Wyatt kept pace with them as they walked from the arena into the holding pit. So, Wyatt started, attempting to entice some kind of reaction. Had you guys going there, didn't I? Wyatt's humor was met with silence. Isaiah was outpacing Wyatt slightly, his long, ebony dreadlocks swaying a little with each step. But as the man moved and his thick dreadlocks shifted from his face, Wyatt was sure he glimpsed a smile. Wyatt couldn't wipe his own grin off his face. The two stepped into the corridor that connected the holding pit with the main bar, and Isaiah scanning each patron as they passed by. Many who insisted on grabbing at Wyatt, running hands across his face, clapping his shoulder or shaking his hands. Isaiah's hulking frame kept them from doing anything more brazen. Despite all the touching, Wyatt let himself enjoy the attention. He deserved it. He was the creator's champion after all. Frey's champion. Wyatt heard the thudding of bodies against concrete and the eruption of screams behind him before he saw anything. Like a whirlwind, Isaiah spun around and flattened Wyatt to the floor, leaping over his person to get to the commotion. A burly-looking man dressed fit for the circuit games plunged his way towards them. There was no mistaking who had caused the chaos. From between Isaiah's feet, Wyatt spotted a glowing headband on the man's head, similar to the one Frey and Jasper dumped on him whenever they were attempting to do something covert. Strangely, Wyatt hadn't realized until this moment how alike an electric crown the device looked. The man's face was blank, except for the look of utter determination etched into it. As he stormed towards them, maneuvering patrons roughly as he went, Wyatt watched in horror when the man grabbed a hold of a nearby woman who struggled to get out of his way fast enough. His large hands wrapped around her fragile neck, forcibly smashing her against the concrete wall of the corridor. The woman's head impacted with a sickening crack. Her attacker discarded her quickly and her unconscious form slid down the wall, a trail of blood mapping her descent. There was not so much of a flicker of emotion in the face of the perpetrator as he continued his march forward. Instead, his brown eyes, which looked as crazy as the demon from Jeepers Creepers, looked downwards, meeting Wyatt's gaze. Isaiah retained his defensive stance in front of Wyatt, like a lion protecting his pride. His legs were slightly bent, his body turned for combat. Isaiah's hands were raised before him, ready for anything. Wyatt marveled at the collected expression on Isaiah's face, as danger crept ever closer to them. At a meter away, the man dove for Wyatt, attempting to skirt out of Isaiah's reach. Inhumanly fast, Isaiah grabbed the man's shoulders, a solid blockade, forcing the man back. As the man stumbled, Isaiah punched him in the face, his fist sounding as heavy as a brick colliding with a mound of flesh. The man staggered, but recovered from the blow quickly. Too quickly, judging from the look of surprise that sprung up uncharacteristically on Isaiah's face. The attacker rushed forward again, this time targeting Isaiah, reciprocating Isaiah's blow with a strength that clearly caught the warrior unaware. Before Isaiah could make a move, the man followed the hit through with a well-placed elbow to Isaiah's nose before twisting his hands into Isaiah's thick dreadlocks and yanking his head downwards to meet the man's knee. Whilst Isaiah struggled against the man's furious assault, Wyatt crawled backwards like a starfish, attempting to get out of the way, looking for an opportunity to rise to be of help. Wyatt caught Isaiah's eye, his head still lowered by the attack. He knew Isaiah could see the questioning, frightened look on Wyatt's face that asked, should he get up and help fight the man off? Should he run for Jasper and Frey? No, Isaiah mouthed at him, his eyes seeming to flash blue in the second their gazers interconnected. Quick as lightning, Isaiah pulled out of the man's grip and twisted, kicking him square in the genitals. The man moved instinctively to clutch at himself, and Isaiah exploited the opportunity by launching his palm upwards, crushing the man's nose with a sickening crispy sound. Wyatt cringed. He wouldn't have been surprised to learn that Isaiah had cracked the attacker's nose right up into his brain. The man hit the concrete deck with a heavy thud, his body bouncing slightly upon impact from the floor. The device on the attacker's head detached from his skull and rolled across the floor, coming to a stop near Wyatt. The glow of the device now shut off. Wyatt glanced at Isaiah, who was distracted, scanning the corridor for further signs of danger before pocketing the crown unnoticed. Once deciding the immediate danger had been successfully averted, Isaiah shifted his stance back to guard mode, his breathing even, as if he hadn't just played Street Fighter in the corridor. Wyatt couldn't help but be impressed. Two thickly set security guards pushed between the scared and curious patrons to get to Isaiah and Wyatt. With a nod to Isaiah, they pulled the unconscious perpetrator from the ground, lifting him roughly by the arms. Each guard wore a blatant look of disgust on their faces as they tried to avoid the blood spurting from the man's nose and drenching his face and shirt. Isaiah nodded respectfully back at them. From the direction of the placement arena, a lithely muscled man made his way towards them, ignoring the panicked spectators that lined the walls of the corridor. Surprisingly, Isaiah allowed the man to pass by, though he watched him with fiercely territorial gaze as he approached. He reached a hand down to Wyatt, who took it gratefully, getting a good look at the man as he stood up. Clearly of an exotic Asian heritage, the man had perfectly clear skin, his eyebrows arched and his almond eyes warm, offsetting a sharp, handsome jaw. A skeleton of a particularly nasty-looking fish tattoo peeked out from his bare neck and chest, exposed by a low-slung, stylishly ripped shirt. "And that's why you don't touch ground cloud," the man commented in a jovial, friendly voice cutting through Wyatt's tension. "Thanks," Wyatt replied, swatting the floor's debris from his shirt and pants. He met the man's eye, curious about the newcomer who'd sought him out. "What's ground cloud?" "Circuit's drug of choice." Pike's voice was sly, amused even, hinting at a circuit secret. He offered Wyatt a confident hand to shake. "Pike." Wyatt shook Pike's hand, grasping it steadily, surprising even himself after recent events, though Pike's calm demeanor led him to believe that this activity was nothing unusual. Pike inclined his head as if Wyatt had passed some kind of little test. He lingered on Wyatt's face a little too long for comfort. "Well, Wyatt, look forward to seeing what else you have in store for us, he said with a smile. You sure do know how to entertain. Pike's smile spread into a grin, and he signaled a goodbye with a twitch of a hand before disappearing into the crowd of reawakening circuit patrons. Isaiah placed a hand on Wyatt's shoulder and pushed him onwards back in the direction of the main bar. As they reached the cusp of the corridor adjoining the stairwell that led back to the bar, a young woman dressed in black with so many piercings in her ears Wyatt wondered how all the metal didn't weigh the waif-like woman down, settled past Wyatt, close enough that he could feel the wind of her movement as she ran down the stairs. The woman's hair was bright and multicolored, like that of a rainbow, and a thunderbolt tattooed hand carried a thick envelope with the same marking. The circuit games? Or the circus games? Wyatt couldn't help but wonder.
Frey paced the length of the room slowly, keeping an eye on Wyatt, who was seated in the corner past the bar alongside Jasper, Fergus, and Isaiah. They'd all let out a sigh of relief at Wyatt's placement. It had gone better than they'd hoped by far. But the night was barely half over, and Isaiah had already needed to protect him against an aggressively high patron. Frey was reluctant to think of how else the night could go wrong. Glancing around the room, Frey was sure she'd spotted a tuft of rainbow hair, instantly reminding her of Nyx, that she-devil's little lackey. A slight surge of adrenaline spiked through her body. She never attended the placement round. As a recurrent Circuit Games champion, she didn't have to compete until round 2, if she was choosing to compete this time at all. Frey looked again, but the head was gone, replaced instead by the oversized forms of Rin, Candy, and Storm, clad in their usual uniform of almost nothing. Their outfits matched the vibrancy of their hair. The women roamed the bar area with nondiscreet holster bags filled with what she knew to be ground cloud. Frey exhaled in a complex combination of relief and annoyance. Ground cloud, the Circuit Games drug of choice, instilled an utterly euphoric bliss to most, with mild side effects of increased energy and strength. But for others it resulted in uncharacteristic and erratic behaviors. The consequences of the drug upon human consumption was largely dependent on the consumer's pre-existing medical conditions, genetic predispositions, and how the drug was consumed. And Frey knew that the Circuit Games crowd had figured out how to ingest ground cloud a multitude of ways in the years since the drug's introduction. A clear cause for Wyatt and Isaiah's earlier confrontation in the corridor. The three women passed by two of the competing pilots, Axel and Banshee. Frey spotted the quick handover of cash from Banshee to the electric blue-haired Storm, who counted it before passing it on to Candy, Hell's pink-haired girlfriend, who shoved the wad of cash between her melon-sized breasts. She nodded to Rin. Frey had never been a fan of Rin. Sure, she was vivacious and curvy, but she was also sly as a fox, the ringleader of the trio. Bertha had instated the purple-haired beauty as her designated ground cloud pusher for all 3 rounds of the Circuit Games, and God knows where else. Frey knew of the rumors that circulated the circuit, that Rin had been found in a brothel, and Frey wondered if she'd been taken under the wing of her previous madam. Also because despite Frey's disdain for the woman, she could clearly see that Rin clearly had leadership qualities that enabled her to successfully shepherd her underlings to push more ground cloud than Frey could keep track of. From behind Storm and Candy, Rin stepped forward, handing over 2 canisters of ground cloud from one of her hip holsters, and Frey watched curiously as Banshee thanked Rin with a kiss that lasted a moment longer than a friendly peck on the lips. Banshee moved off with Axel, leaving Rin with a radiant, smug look on her face. Banshee had just given Rin a gift she valued even more than business: conquest. Each of the trio saw the Circuit Games as a bit of a sexual meat factory, and conquests of patrons and pilots were just part of the competition grind. What really got them going was the conquest of the top-ranking pilots, and any celebrities that attended the competitions, like the creators and their champions. Frey had watched Rin chase after Jasper for years, her biggest unattained prize, and the entire world of the Circuit Games knew exactly why she hadn't managed to get into that man's pants yet. A commotion at her right caused Frey to throw her glance towards an outrageously cyberpunk-adorned drag queen who twerked tauntingly in the face of Ninja, a competing pilot from earlier who'd suffered a humiliating loss. Fellow pilot Pike was seated next to Ninja, gave a reassuring incline of his head, urging Ninja to turn the other cheek, keeping a check on his rising temper. The drag queen smirked, reveling in her effect on the young pilot. She twerked a little closer, her ass rubbing against Ninja's cheek, and Frey withheld a laugh as the pilot snapped, shoving the drag queen away from him roughly. Shocked at the pilot's outburst, the drag queen spun on her heel and shoved Ninja right back, who staggered, only to be caught from falling flat on his face by Pike. "Hey," a stern voice boomed from above the electronic music blaring throughout the room. A blonde, stocky, middle-aged woman came into view dressed in a plunging V-neck top and an over-tightened corset belt that struggled against the fleshy waist and black leather pants. She stomped into the commotion in a pair of black stilettos that closely resembled stripper heels. Bertha, the Round 1 circuit game supervisor, had finally made her first appearance for the evening, and she was pissed. Bertha shoved harshly at both drag queen and Ninja. "Take it outside." The drag queen looked ready to burst into patronizing giggles, a contrast to Ninja's seething expression. The tension between the two held firm until Pike stepped in again, leading Ninja towards the circuit's exit. The drag queen, unable to restrain herself against having the last word, taunted, "Bye, Felicia," at Ninja's retreating back. Ninja moved as if to launch himself back towards the drag queen, but Pike tightened his grip on the pilot's shoulder and continued to move him along. Frey felt a tiny ounce of respect develop for the pilot. Pike was relatively new, having only attended the last 3 games and competed in the last 2. So far, his scores had been pretty average. He'd shown no exceptional skill or genius-level intelligence. Pike had never been one to go out of his way to suck up to the creators, and had instead kept it to a friendly chit-chat amongst the other pilots and patrons. No one knew much about his life outside the circuit games, but that wasn't uncommon. The circuit games was a world where those suffering isolated or disconnected existences could come play out their innermost fantasies. The circuit was a haven for the unusual. Whilst Frey contemplated the retreating Pike, Bertha, who decided her situation was rectified, stalked out of the mass of the crowd and moved towards the bar. She lifted a bottle of blue alcohol from the bar's surface as she headed out of the room and down another corridor. Frey made her way back over to the lounging corner, just off from the right side of the bar, where she'd left Wyatt, Jasper, Fergus, and Isaiah seated on furniture constructed of makeshift crates and plywood, with the miscellaneous pillows strewn across the surfaces. As she neared, she realized Fergus and Isaiah must have moved on to prepare for the circuit's next round, leaving Wyatt alone with Jasper. Hunter was situated at the end of the bar, and stood drinking and flirting with one of Mab's girls. As Frey passed him by, Hunter's gaze instantly lifted to meet hers. He flicked an eyebrow up, an invitation to come hither. Frey only smirked back, and settled down in the empty space next to Wyatt and Jasper, the latter whom was attempting to feed Wyatt a neon blue shot. Jasper held the shot out to Wyatt, dangling it before his face. 1. You get 1, kid. I'm not sure I want one. Wyatt still looked a little unnerved from the earlier attack. Frey didn't blame him for being wary of the circuit's beverages. Jasper pushed Wyatt harder. Don't be a pussy, shot it and say thank you. A waitress carrying a tray full of the neon shots passed their party, and Frey raised a hand, capturing her attention. The waitress lowered her tray for Frey to take her pick. Her hand did a full circle of the tray before she made her selection, and the waitress moved off. Frey downed the blue fire in one gulp, careful to mask her face at the liquid's contact with her throat. She inclined her head towards Wyatt. A little braver after Frey's demonstration, Wyatt downed the contents of his own glass. Barely a second passed before he began to splutter at the drink's potency. Gee, thanks, he managed to cough out, his voice husky from the burning. Jasper and Frey both broke into laughter. It's got a kick, Frey said. From the corner of her eye, Frey caught sight of the circus rakish trio snaking their way towards the men. Rin's eyes set predatorily on Jasper. Beside her, Jasper straightened, noticing the same thing. Strutting within arm's reach, each of the trio ran their hands over Wyatt. trailing fingers dancing across his limbs before making a beeline for Jasper, who welcomed their attention. Frey watched with amusement as Wyatt wriggled uncomfortably when Candy's hand skimmed the edge of his crutch. Wyatt had flushed and looked straight to Frey for her response, like a high schooler caught with his hands in his pants. That kiss between herself and Wyatt earlier, yes. She'd done it to push Wyatt over the line and get him back out there in the arena. Men were hunters and providers. They were also peacocks, and sometimes you needed to give them incentive to provide and peacock for. But when their lips touched, there was something else. A spark. Even thinking about it made Frey feel a little sick, and the spark as their bodies connected. Frey didn't want to think about it. It wasn't relevant. She just needed to get him through the placement round and now through the next one too. Rin, Candy, and Storm situated themselves around Jasper, Wyatt, and Frey in uncomfortably close quarters. "Sorry to crash the party," Candy said coyly, grinning around at them, her bright pink eyeshadow sparkling beneath the flashing lights overhead. Storm's voice was a purr as she chimed in. "We just had to congratulate you on your champion's ranking." "Come to meet the kid, did you?" Jasper questioned. Frey watched in silence as she spotted the small flicker of doubt in Jasper's confident smirk. Rin slinked her way closest to Jasper, her breasts almost in his face as she half slid into his lap. "Well, no. You know we can't resist rubbing shoulders with the creators." Frey let out an unladylike snort. "Yes, darling. I'm sure it's his shoulders you want to rub." Mistaking Frey's tone as jealousy for Rin's attention, Storm sauntered over to Frey, her fingers wrapping delicately around a neon blue shot. She sipped half of the liquid back before tracing the rim of her glass tantalizingly with her tongue. Storm's brown eyes meeting Frey's steel. She offered Frey the glass, a myriad of promise in her expression. Frey heard Wyatt swallow loudly. Frey found herself amused. "Oh, sweet girl, you're definitely barking up the wrong tree." She snatched the shot glass from Storm and placed it before Wyatt. "You should try a different audience." Wyatt turned a confused, panicked expression on Frey. Thank you, but no." Cocking her head at Wyatt, Frey broke into laughter, again, at the intense red flush on his face. Rin, looking pouty and resentful, took control of the situation, flipping the attention back to her. She leaned into Jasper, breathing him in. "Can I get your autograph?" Jasper's face broke into a cocky grin as Rin passed him a marker. Raising a brow, Frey knew this little request of Rin's was going to make Jasper insufferable, at least for the next week. Jasper held his hand open in anticipation of some kind of paper, but Rin simply smiled and zipped her top down slowly, stopping on the cusp of indecency. She offered up her two perfectly formed breasts. Frey bit her lip and looked around the room, scanning the faces of the crowd. Hunter was still flirting with Mab's girls by the bar. The patrons were faceless beside some scattered pilots from earlier, consumed with their factions and house music blasting through the room. The roving waitress still weaved between bodies with her tray of blue favors. No sign of nicks, no flash of crimson-red hair. Rin was brazenly and publicly making her move on Jasper, a first for her, and Frey was surprised she had the guts to do so. There was no doubt that the word would get around, no doubt that there would likely be consequence for Rin that she would find particularly unpleasurable. But hey, if two women Frey despised wanted to go at it over Jasper, who was she to stand in their way? She could certainly think of worse things than Jasper moving on from that traitorous bitch. Jasper, grin plastered ear to ear, took Rin's bait. "You know, the lights are a little dim out here," he said, squinting around the room. "Let's go somewhere where I can get a better look at what I'm, doing." Frey couldn't refrain from rolling her eyes as Rin, Candy, and Storm's faces all lit up, recognizing that Jasper was quickly becoming a fly caught in their honey trap. "How considerate of you," she commented. Jasper flashed Frey a smirk. "What can I say? I value my penmanship." He stood up, causing a thrilled flurry amongst the trio who gathered to him. Wyatt's face twisted in concern. "Hey, where are you going? The round?" Frey waved Wyatt's anxiety away. "It'll be 2 minutes tops, if he can find it." Jasper smiled and flipped Frey the bird, jutting his hips forward vulgarly. Compact but efficient. He turned to Wyatt. "Don't panic, Princess. We've got plenty of time." The curvy violet-haired beauty laced her fingers through Jasper's and began leading him almost forcefully towards the back storage rooms, Candy and Storm following suit, snaking their hands over every inch of Jasper's body as they went. As Jasper disappeared out of sight, Frey heard him mutter, "Just kidding, ladies. There's nothing compact about it." The smile spreading over Frey's face was genuine. Jasper had always been a ladies' man, but as a sister who watches over a beloved brother, Frey had watched Jasper love deeply, then had helped him pick up the pieces of a broken, betrayed heart. It had taken time for Jasper to transform back into himself from the darkness. For years, only trickles of sunlight peeping through the rotting wall of deceit. But he was coming back, and if Jasper was ready to go fishing again, well then, Frey was ecstatic for him. Grey eyes met with Wyatt's ocean blue. "Welcome to the circuit games."
Wyatt stared at the spot in the crowd that Jasper had disappeared through. This place, the circuit, seemed insane, marvelous, beyond the expectations of his imagination. Not that he'd known what to dream up in the days leading up into the competition. In a single evening, Wyatt had experienced more action than he probably would have his entire life. If he'd never been kidnapped, if he'd never met Frey. He didn't think he'd ever want to go home. "It sure is different," Wyatt said slowly, considering his choice of words to the grey-eyed woman who shifted at Jasper's departure to seat herself on the plywood table in front of him. Since Frey's return from her lap of the room, she'd shown no sign of acknowledging their earlier kiss. Now, for the first time since that moment, they'd suddenly found themselves alone. Wyatt wasn't sure what to say. He felt clammy, and he hated that. Greg would never be clammy in a situation like this. Then again, Greg would probably have a knife pulled across his throat after trying to convince Frey to fuck him in the circuit bathrooms. Wyatt followed Frey's gaze across the room as she focused on the drag queen, writhing her body like a sensual snake around a metal stripper pole for the seduction of one of the competing pilots, Nero. He recognized. Frey spoke softly. "Think of it as a heightened reality. You put something underground and people feel sheltered enough to show their true colors, or at least the colors they'd like you to think they have." Wyatt was thoughtful. He could resonate with that. "I guarantee you most of them would be a little more gray topside." "Is that how all of this started?" Wyatt asked curiously, gesturing to the weird and colorful patrons around them as some kind of cyber-bohemian utopia. Frey lifted an eyebrow. "For some," she stated simply, unwilling to elaborate. The familiar tone in her voice caught Wyatt off guard. So close to the tone back in the place they'd been keeping him. Closed. Businesslike. Wyatt didn't like the feeling that Frey was attempting to lead him back around in a full circle. He struggled to keep them heading straight ahead. "Geez, you're cryptic." Frey flashed him a knowing smile. "Part of my charm." Wyatt considered how far he could push his luck with her in one night, but his nagging questions got the better of him. He decided to go for it. "So why did you create the programming?" Frey's face didn't even flicker. "Same reason I'm here now." And there it was, her admission. The reason why Frey and Jasper were addressed as the creators. Wyatt got the sense that she was talking in riddles, but he didn't understand how. He couldn't fit the pieces together. "I'm guessing that's not to sign autographs?" The mild tension that had begun to grow between them broke and Frey laughed, probably thinking back to Jasper's explicit escape with the trio. Wyatt took it as his own little personal victory. "Come on, give me something here." Wyatt was practically begging. He couldn't help it. He wanted her to keep talking, keep explaining. He wanted her to laugh again. Frey considered her answer here. I'm here for the technology. My technology. I created what someone else might have easily exploited. Wyatt pushed further, confused. And you let other people run the circuit games because... Frey turned her eyes to his, boring down into his soul. Give any one person too much power, and the circuit becomes a dictatorship. Wyatt processed her words, feeling like there was some kind of double meaning he was missing. Okay. Wyatt threw his hands up, a gesture of surrender. Though what he had left to give, he had no idea. Fair point, so where do I fit in? Frey took a breath, letting the moment hover between them before she offered him a steely side smirk. We'll soon see.
Nick stood in the cold blackness of the concrete corridor, the unflattering fluorescent light from overhead turning her hand a weird shade of pasty green as she knocked on the door of the dressing room shared by the circuit game's hosts and supervisor. The thick envelope in her hand adopted the same sickening hue. Tempest, her pilot, her idol, her friend, was really pushing the circuit's boundaries tonight, and Nyx felt hesitant about her plan and how it was going to work out, for all of them. Tempest had been undefeated circuit champion since the games had begun years ago, but even for her there were limits. Regardless of the rock star, starstruck thrall she kept the patrons sucked into. That was the only reason Gunnar, Manning, and each of the round supervisors even attempted to play nice with Tempest. She was a luxury, a gimmick, and cash cow for them all. Nyx stepped closer to the door with trepidation and listened carefully. The slight rustle heard from the room within indicated the room's occupants were ignoring her. She knocked again, this time more aggressively. The shuffling inside the room increased and the big black door swung open, revealing Gunnar in a fluffy pink dressing gown. The man scowled at her as she peered around his immense frame and caught a glimpse of Manning primping himself before a Hollywood-lit mirror, mascara wand in hand. No autographs right now, kid. This is our downtime. No respect. No recognition of Nyx as Tempest's second, her pit captain, common knowledge in the circuit. Nyx rolled her eyes at Gunnar and shoved hard at the dressing room door, barging inside and scanning the room. From behind her, a shoulder smacked into the side of her own. Nyx spun, catching sight of Bertha, who pushed past her to flop in an unladylike manner onto the aged leather couch, planting a bottle of the circuit's infamous blue booze on the coffee table in front of her. Nyx eyed her silently, with the confidence Tempest had instilled in her during her service to the Circuit Royale. She waited for Bertha to acknowledge her as the supervisor pulled a wad of cash out of the bum bag clinched around her waist and began counting the money on the table's surface, laying it out in piles. Bertha was a force of her own, her blonde curly hair wild, and her face aging and worn, covered in makeup so thick Nyx could never tell if it was there to hide fading beauty or trying to fake it altogether. In her tight corset, and her freckled breast almost entirely on display, Bertha was the perfect example of mutton dressed as lamb in every sense of the phrase. The supervisor dragged out her actions for a few long moments before she turned her painted face towards Nyx, calmly looking up from the pile of money. A power play to show Nyx who the boss in the room was. Nyx spoke first, asserting herself. Tempest wants to make some changes to tonight's run order. Does she now? Bertha raised her eyebrows in amusement and reclined back, daring Nyx to go on. But Nyx wasn't playing. She waited for Bertha to speak again. Well, you can tell Lady Muck she can lick my tit. Nyx didn't so much as flinch at Bertha's candid vulgarity. Instead, she just tossed her an envelope onto the table before the woman, watching as Bertha checked the heftiness of it, her eyes lighting up. Bertha turned a far more pleasant face towards Nyx, her lips creeping into a smile, and Nyx knew Tempest would be pleased.
Fergus stood before the urinal with his hand loosely wrapped around his penis as he tried to hurry the process of relieving himself up. He didn't like the dingy circuit bathrooms that already reeked of all kinds of bodily fluids, any more than he liked being away from Frey and Jasper. The idea of running behind schedule or the eyes of their Isaiah, watching him from his guard-like position by the bathroom entrance. The stream of piss began to slow and then stopped. Fergus gave a little shake, careful to avoid the splashback. He pulled up his coveralls and refastened them before taking a grease wipe out from one of his numerous pockets and used it to twist the tap of the sink. As he put the grease wipe away and commenced the methodical process of hand washing, the toilet in the stall at the far end of the bathroom flushed, the door swinging open shortly after. Fergus noticed the thunderbolt tattoo across the man's hand before he recognized the green eyes and curly black hair of Zane, Tempest's third. As dread built within Fergus's stomach, he struggled to remain collected and tried to refocus on washing his hands. But Zane, recognizing Fergus, sidled up to the sink beside him. He brushed his shoulder unnecessarily against Fergus's. Don't look, Fergus." Fergus couldn't help but raise his eyes to Zane's face. Despite his internal pleading, he couldn't help but stare at the elaborate nose piercing punched into his flesh. Zane met his gaze with a sneer. From the door, Isaiah cleared her throat and Zane glanced quickly in Isaiah's direction before returning to Fergus, watching him, eyes staring him down. It was all Fergus could do to not shrink under Zane's gaze. Through sheer force of will, Fergus turned the tap with his bare hand, limiting contact with the metal to just one, and tried to walk calmly towards Isaiah, who swung the bathroom door open for his exit. He strode out. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, and the door closed heavily behind him. Fergus checked over his shoulder for Isaiah's presence before he broke into a run. Jasper stepped over the unconscious body of a circuit patron lying passed out. Across the floor of the entrance to the warehouse's storeroom, the man's hand was still loosely clutched to a mask pressed against his face, the cord dangling from it connected to a small gray canister with a cloud on it, its little light flashing red, on empty. Jasper let a low snicker as he guided a hand-clasped Rin over the man's frame, Storm and Candy giggling behind them. He led the women into the darkest recess of the room, a space surrounded by crates and packaging boxes, some almost head height. Yes, Jasper thought, they were unlikely to be interrupted here. Satisfied with the seclusion, Jasper pulled Rin towards him as Storm and Candy closed in on the two of them. Rin was pretty, he'd give her that. Beautiful, even. The purple of the circuit's voluminous wig contrasted flatteringly with the porcelain skin of her delicately structured face and full, cherry lips. Rin was confident, loud, ambitious. Rin hunted for what she wanted. Rin, who wanted to be the rock star so badly, but just kept missing the mark when compared to her. Jasper shook the thoughts of her from his mind. She had left him. She had betrayed him. It had been long enough. So long it was becoming embarrassing, and Jasper needed to move forward with his life. She wasn't coming back to him, and he couldn't take her back even if he tried. And now, Jasper deserved to have his fun again, after everything. Jasper stared down into Rin's smiling face, her expression inviting and filled with lust. He leaned forward and kissed her deeply with the furious passion of an animal in heat, driven only by an incessant painful need to fuck. He bit her lip and swirled his tongue around through her mouth, tasting her wholly and fully. Rin moaned sweetly against his lips and raised both his hands to her chest, helping him fumble through the unzipping of her top. She helped guide the zip all the way down, exposing plump, round breasts, and pressed against him, her mouth starved for his. Storm and Candy, still giggling, slid Jasper's coat from his shoulders and struggled to pull Jasper's shirt up over his head. Jasper helped them along and flung the fabric to the floor. The hands began roving his chest and abs before wandering down his pants, kissing his body as they slithered around him. One of their hands clutched at his penis, fully boned, and Jasper let out a guttural moan at the contact of its sensitive skin. He felt the zip of his pants come down and Rin's lips released him. A firm hand maneuvered Jasper's head towards Storm and Candy, both women smirking at him, before sharing a seductive kiss, if you could call it that. Jasper grinned as Storm and Candy's tongues licked at each other explicitly, an example of what they had in mind for his dick. Jasper had no idea why he hadn't let the trio have their way with him sooner. "I knew I'd find you here," Jasper's smile faltered as her voice seemed to echo around him. He turned his head this way and that, trying to glimpse where she would descend upon him in the storage room's dim light. So predictable. Tempest spoke again, stepping into Jasper's view. She looked the same as the last time he'd seen her. Her hair red as blood and her eyes a blaze of green fire. Her skin still pale and creamy, glowing against the black of her leather outfit, lit up like a gothic fairy grove. Even as he despised her, even as he resented her intrusion, his fingers ached for her. Tempest stepped a little closer, flanked by Nyx and Zane and 3 others of her faction, each one etched with her Thunderbolt insignia upon their hands. Jasper knew she'd built a little kingdom for herself, and he despised her all the more for it. Jasper reached for Rin, and her hand ran over her exposed breasts. "Piss off," he barked harshly at Tempest's arrogantly smirking face. "I'm busy." He watched with some satisfaction as Tempest's eyes flicked briefly to his hand on Rin's breast, and he hoped that somewhere deep inside it was cutting her. But Tempest only shrugged. "What? It takes 3 whores to get you up now?" She barely turned her head to take in Rin, Candy, and Storm before giving them a little one-fingered motion. "Shoo." From beneath his hand, Jasper had felt Rin grow wary, perhaps even fearful of Tempest as the seconds ticked on. Reluctantly, he released the woman. She and the others disengaged herself from him. Rin headed straight for the exit, zipping up her top as she went and ushering Candy and Storm along with her. Jasper knew that deep down, Rin wanted to be better than Tempest, but not enough to so blatantly risk Tempest's wrath. Flirting with Jasper was one thing. Fighting for him was another. He followed Rin, Candy, and Storm's retreating figures out of sight before flashing an annoyed gaze back in Tempest's direction. Reigning champions have a green light into round 2. "So what, are you slumming on your night off?" Tempest's smirk grew. If that was even possible, pleased she was getting under Jasper's skin. Something like that. Unconvinced, he reached down to retrieve his shirt and flipped it over his head. Tempest's green eyes followed his every move, every flex of his body. "A little birdie told me you'd finally found yourself a champion. Cutting it a little close, don't you think?" Jasper stayed silent, his face an expression of boredom. Inside, his guts did a somersault. Tempest probed again. Considering how badly the last one failed, and how quickly the winners seemed to scamper away. Jasper raised an eyebrow at her. "You always were a jealous bitch. Come to check out your replacement, have you?" She sneered, baring shiny white teeth in response. "Do us both a favor and stop pretending that sad little boy could ever possibly replace me." One heeled foot after another, Tempest slunk towards him, regal, arrogant, and radiating fire. Unless, of course, you started batting for the other team. I did have my suspicions. Behind Tempest, her flunkies laughed, and Jasper fought to retain control over his hastily rising temper. He took a step towards Tempest, meeting her attack. "Funny. This sad little boy is scoring so high I'm ready to get on my knees for him. And it would still be an upgrade." His taunt verbally slapped Tempest across the face, landing hard. "Do us all a favor and go crawl back onto the rock you came from." Zane, who flanked Tempest, left, clenched his fist in anger, and moved towards Jasper, motivated to defend his champion. But Tempest calmly raised delicate hands to stop the man, and Jasper had to wonder if Tempest had averted the confrontation for her own sake, or that of Zane's. She couldn't possibly think her man-pet could best him. Now, play nice." Jasper laughed at her mockingly. "Pot, meet kettle black." "I have my moments." The corners of Tempest's lips twitched into an almost smile, the first hint of authenticity from his ex-lover so far. Jasper widened his stance and folded his arms, preparing for Tempest's next move. But she held her tongue, waiting. Jasper decided not to stick around and play. "Not that I wouldn't love to stay here and listen to you talk out of your ass all night, but I'd rather lay down in front of some oncoming traffic." Jasper walked towards the room's exit, straight past Tempest and her flunkies. When he hovered almost out of sight, she spoke again. "You and Frey always did underestimate me." Jasper jolted at her words. He used to know this woman inside out, how she tasted, how she thought. He could read the tone in her voice or look in her eyes and instantly know. But tonight, that last little line that spilled from her mouth sounded like words thickened by sadness and sarcastic satisfaction. The Tempest who stood before him was sporadic, self-centered, and unpredictable. Dread seeped down the back of Jasper's neck. What the fuck have you done? But Tempest just batted her eyelashes blankly at him. Make sure you get a good seat. I wouldn't want you to miss the show. With that, she turned her on a heel and sauntered past him and out of the storage room, her 5 lemmings following closely behind her.
Frey's perception of Wyatt continued to change between that of a sour-faced, sarcastic young man to a man with ambition, intelligence, and curiosity. As she watched him studying the dwindling patrons in the bar area as they made their way back to the arena for the upcoming formal round 1, she wondered if tonight would mark the beginning of Wyatt's true journey into manhood, his first step towards something great, or if tonight would become one of the most catastrophic moments in Wyatt's life. Frey had expected Wyatt's anxiety to increase as time ticked towards the next round, one of absolute judgment that would make or break his inclusion into round 2. But Wyatt had seemed relaxed, too much so, perhaps feeling he had proved himself in the placement round, and now his intrigue laid with her. Alone, their conversation skittered between Wyatt's attempt at dry humor and his incessant questioning about the circuit games, about her, about everything. She almost breathed a sigh of relief when she heard Fergus shout her name repetitively, until she registered the panic in his voice. "Frey!" he shouted a 3rd time as he rushed towards her, Isaiah hot on his tail. "Where's Jasper?" "Finishing up autographs, I think." Fergus struggled to catch his breath. "We need to find him. Tempest is here." Frey sighed. She'd been right when she'd caught sight of Nyx's rainbow hair, and deep down, she'd known that there was always a chance Tempest would want to show her face to her adoring circuit fans. A validation hit for a woman so obviously low on dopamine. But she'd still hoped the bitch would stay away, at least for Jasper's sake, and at least until round 2. But if she was slinking around somewhere, Frey knew Tempest would already be aware of Wyatt's record-breaking placement score and was probably interpreting it as a declaration of war. Nothing mattered more to that woman than her reigning title. She'd proven that. The circuit games had other champions, sure, but Tempest was the first, their first, and she remained undefeated every time she competed, her scores never beaten. Until now. Frey rolled her eyes at Fergus and Isaiah. Wonderful. Fergus was already fishing into his coveralls. Here. He pulled out his tablet, unlocked it, and held the device out to Frey, who noted his mildly shaking hand. The screen of the device showed a loading icon in the middle of the official covert website for the circuit games. The website was counting down to refresh. The placements and rankings for the first round were up less than half an hour ago, Fergus explained. Wyatt was to face Hunter, formidable, but statistically favorable. Frey didn't like where this was going, her mind already racing ahead. Now they're refreshing, which means they're reconfiguring. Frey clicked on. That's not good. Frey knew without a doubt that somehow Tempest was wrapped up in the middle of this. She'd made her first play against them. But in what capacity exactly? What was her endgame? Frey raised her eyes back to Fergus, who was scanning the area around her. Where's Wyatt? Frey glanced around, following Fergus's gaze. Wyatt was suddenly nowhere in sight. That sneaky shit. Frey jumped to her feet.
Wyatt sat on the closed lid of a dirty toilet in the graffitied, stinking male bathroom of the circuit. He chewed his lip as he gathered his courage. Before he'd slipped away from Frey, Fergus, and Isaiah, he'd noticed the tension between them. The look of panic on Fergus's face. The alarm on Frey's. But he already knew their pattern. Whatever was going on, there was no way they were going to tell him. They'd keep him right out of it. And Wyatt didn't care. Because what he really wanted was the truth of the circuit games. And Wyatt was going to find that out. All by himself. Wyatt plunged his hand into the pocket and fished out the device that had fallen from the lolling head of his would-be attacker earlier. That pilot, Pike, had told him it was ground cloud related. Drug related. But Wyatt didn't think anyone noticed the crown-like tech that had fallen from the man's head, or that Wyatt had pocketed it. He turned the tech over in his hands, roving the metal with a keen eye. For a millisecond, Wyatt was sure he saw some kind of light flicker. The door to the men's bathroom slammed loudly and heavily. Imposing footsteps stomped towards him. Wyatt gulped as they continued to come closer, stopping outside of his cubicle. Wyatt stopped breathing, still as death. The new bathroom guest hit the door, causing it to fling open, and it narrowly missed smacking straight into Wyatt. As it whacked into the stall wall and dented it, Wyatt scampered further back on his toilet lid. He yanked on the zip, pretending to do up his pants as Isaiah revealed himself in the doorway. "What the hell, dude?" Wyatt gasped out loud. Isaiah went silent, his face blank, unimpressed. He reached out to Wyatt, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him towards the exit.
Frey rounded the corner, lurching into the concrete corridor that led to the dressing room. Behind her, keeping up with her furious pace, was Fergus, who clutched at his tablet, along with Wyatt and Isaiah, who acted as an inescapable force, shepherding Wyatt between them all. God only knew why Wyatt had chosen then to sneak off, and Frey didn't really want to think about the why. Jasper appeared in sight, merging into their pathway from across corridor a couple of meters ahead. The man charged forward without noticing them, clearly on a mission of his own. Frey could bet her beloved boots it was the same one. She called to him. "Jasper?" Jasper spun around and paused his stride, waiting for them to catch up. They began to move as a unit towards the dressing room. "She's here." "I know." Frey wondered how exactly he'd found out. The soldier looked like he'd just had his feathers ruffled, and not in the just got laid way. "She's up to something," he spoke again. "I know." From behind them, lagging Wyatt called out, "Is someone going to fill me in here?" The unit ignored him. Wyatt needs not even registered as a priority. He could wait. He'd sure made them wait. Suddenly, Fergus stopped his rapid march mid-step, causing Wyatt to knock into him. Frey turned in unison with Jasper, and the two caught the fear in Fergus's eyes as he stared down at the tablet in his hands. The Circuit Games website finally loaded with new Round 1 run orders. Fergus spoke, eyes wide. "Wyatt is to verse Tempest. That sneaky, sneaky bitch." Frey had known that Tempest wouldn't take Wyatt's placement score with any kind of grace, but this, her response was simply pure annihilation. Beside her, Jasper hit the wall, his frustration evident in the sickening thwack of flesh and bone against concrete. The man was reckless with himself, and it was moments like this that she was glad Jasper had that little helping tech hand on his insides keeping him safe, despite the fact that he hated it. Jasper growled, low and dangerous. "Damn it." Gunnar and Manning were camped out in front of their large Hollywood mirror, making the final adjustments to their makeup for the round ahead. The conclusion of the first round for the Circuit Games. She eyed the two men, opposites in every way physically, with disdain as Gunnar fiddled with his hair and Manning powdered his face. Those two wore more makeup than she did. Bertha had been roped into the Circuit Games 5 years ago, and every half year, like clockwork, the circus started up again. Bertha started up again, the ringleader of her Round 1, the role she took with pain and pleasure, and always with her freedom in mind. Because Bertha had an endgame. The door of the dressing room swung open without so much as a knock, and Bertha wrinkled her face at the disrespect, until she saw the girls, Rin, Storm, and Candy, flutter into the room in all their scandalous glory, grins etched into each of their faces. Her girls paused before her, Rin gesturing to Candy, who handed over a large wad of cash sourced from within her bag to Bertha's awaiting hands. Bertha smiled. These three she could count on. These three knew how to do as they were told. "How many more do you think you could move tonight?" Bertha asked, addressing her trio. Rin, the closest to her, didn't glance at the other two who flanked her. "Give us another 50 and we'll do what we can." Pure obedience, Bertha thought, and it wasn't too much to ask at all. "That's my girls." She crossed the room and pulled the black leather bag out from behind the couch and handed it to Rin, who checked the bag's contents and smirked, finding it filled to the brim with ground cloud canisters. Rin passed the bag to Storm, who shouldered it and followed Rin from the dressing room as her leader exited. "Bye, Gunnar. Bye, Manning," Storm called out on her way out. "Bye, babies," Manning answered back, still primping with his appearance in the mirror. As Candy moved to follow Storm, Bertha planted a firm slap on Candy's rump as the last of the trio disappeared from the room. She then returned her attention to Gunnar and Manning, impatient with their misplaced decadence. "Come on, ladies, let's hurry it up." Gunnar turned doe-eyed like eyes towards her, a remarkable look for such a bear of a man. "Bertha, my love, you've got to watch those sexist comments." Bertha raised an eyebrow at the playful tone in Gunnar's voice. She was in no mood to be held up because of his and Manning's insane vanity. "If I call you something gender-neutral, will you get your ass out of this door?" She gestured widely towards the dressing room exit. "You cannot rush perfection, Bertha," Manning said, cutting in. "We have an image to uphold here." "He's right, you know. And has anyone ever told you you gesture like an angry Italian?" Bertha visibly scowled. She hated when Gunnar and Manning double-teamed her. It annoyed her to no end. Gunnar smiled at Bertha, picking up on her rapidly depreciating mood. A rare victory in sight. "The organization is only as good as the face that carries it," Bertha sighed. "Gunnar, you're an oversized sock puppet. Finish with the makeup and let's go. There." But Gunnar only batted his overly emphasized eyelashes at her. "But such a handsome sock puppet, right?" Bertha reached down to the coffee table, full of intent to peg her now half-glugged glass bottle of booze at Gunnar's ridiculous head, when the dressing room door burst open again. Bertha expected the return of the trio, or possibly even alcohol-fueled ground cloud-addicted patrons, not the furious face of the creator storming her only semi-private sanctuary. Jasper, his face twisted with rage, made straight for Manning and grabbed him by the throat, shoving him up against the nearest wall. Bertha noticed he held a tablet in one hand and glimpsed the circuit's website open to the competition run order for the impending round 1. Perhaps she should have expected this, been prepared. Free cash was never free cash, after all. Bertha retreated back a pace or two from the violence, and Gunnar rushed behind her as if she was a human shield. From beneath Jasper's hands, Manning whimpered loudly, an embarrassment to both himself and Bertha. A long second passed before the creator finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly with his anger. "Would someone like to tell me what the hell this is?" He held up the tablet, flashing its screen in a semicircle, like a preschooler at show and tell. Bertha tried to think quick, wondering how best to explain herself, how to explain that she'd let Tempest bribe her without Jasper totally losing his shit and possibly strangling Manning to death. Though truth be told, she was considering doing just that if it would shut the small man up. Just as Bertha opened her mouth, hoping she could talk the creator in circles as she figured out some witty way to safety, another problem arrived. Frey stepped through the door, her face a beautiful, pissed-off glower, followed by Fergus, Isaiah, and their new champion, Wyatt. Before Bertha could get a solid glimpse of the young man the creators were betting their futures on, Frey pushed the pilot back into the corridor, an anxious Fergus following him out. Isaiah took a godlike stance up beside the door, and Frey finally turned her glower on Bertha in all its full glory.
You have been listening to episode 4 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. This series is a Red Empire production and a Sound Vision Gold Coast original production, and has been written by Amy Casey, Ellie Popov, and Simon Kennedy.
This series is produced by Amy Casey and Roberto Mellini. Executive produced by myself, Charles Jazz Terrier, Ellie Popov, Steve Chickerell, Wade Boys, and Sherry Hamrick-Rewell. It is co-produced by Alex Contis and Tom Cramsie. Editing, sound design, and music is done by Roberto Mellini and Tom Cramsie. Our production partners are the scandalous, but always effervescent Organic Media Group, and that theme song you keep hearing belongs to my co-host, Ellie Popov.
As you return to your mundane little lives, listeners, my advice to you all is to keep track of our next episode drop. Future information about the series can be found at www.redempireproductions.com. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to us via whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. Join us again. Live beyond your understanding.
Mark my words, I'll find a lie.